This episode is a supplement to regular Inside Israel News episodes. I'll be discussing background related to current events in Israel and the Middle East. This episode is the first in a multi-part series about 4 elections in 2 years, how Israel came to be where it is. As I've described a lot of the background leading up to the current election in Israel, I've described a lot of Israeli politics especially since the 70s, but especially the political era of the aughts and the teens. Now it's time to talk about the most recent events, how the election reached this particular point. Israeli politics on the brink, let's say. They've had 3 elections, all of which proved inconclusive, and now here we are at a 4th election, and Israeli voters are a little bit exacerbated. This is kind of an odd circumstance. It really draws out the differences between parliamentary system, let's say, and a presidential system, because while we can have inconclusive elections from the point of view that one party can win with a divided Congress or what have you, and people can be, let's just say, an agenda can stall. And it can be inconclusive from the point of view that the voters could vote for a certain agenda and then just not be able to implement that agenda because of what happened in the political world. But the elections themselves produce results. When an election happens, someone is elected to office, or a party holds a majority of seats in a legislative house, and they are in control. But in a parliamentary system, especially a multi-party parliamentary system, things are a little more complicated. So this is going to give me an opportunity to talk more about the coalition building process, because it's a really nasty thing. There's the old joke that laws are like sausage. People love to eat them, but they'd be horrified to find out how they're made. Well, coalitions are a great thing to have, but it's a really interesting and not always pleasant process by which they come together to form a government. So I'll dive right into that, describing the first of 2 elections in 2019, and then we'll go on to part 2. As I've described in a recent episode, in 2014, toward the end of 2014, between Naftali Bennett trying to draw the coalition at the time to the right, trying to get language into the basic law that was establishing more firmly Israel's Jewish identity, and building this idea that there'd be some kind of national referendum on any kind of peace deal, things of that nature. So you've got Naftali Bennett trying to cajole the coalition to the right. Meanwhile, Yair Lapid, who was finance minister at the time, was making a number of constitutional reforms, or reforms to the basic laws. I've noted Israel does not have a constitution, and he was trying to pull the coalition leftward with a number of reforms in his direction. And this tug-of-war was problematic against the backdrop of the Obama administration wanting to get rid of Bibi Netanyahu, and so kind of international political forces coalescing around that agenda. And so the Israeli left decided to make a play for power. And when the coalition fell apart, the 2015 election was called. That was when I wrote several articles predicting that the only result of such an election would just be a more right-wing government, that those forces trying to draw the government toward the center were going to be defeated, because the people on the left thought that they had a chance to unseat Netanyahu and form a government of their own, which I didn't see much likelihood that was going to happen. And sure enough, as I've said before, my articles proved to be prophetic at the time. You can check those out if you go to the website insideisrael.news and look at the articles I've written in the past. Go back to 2014, 2015, in that era, and you'll see exactly what I'm talking about. All right. So that election took place. Bibi Netanyahu was able to form a government. That government was more right-wing than it had been. And that government, because the parties in it were more loyal to Netanyahu, was able to go the full 4-year term. But, as I've described in the structure of the Israeli government, the Knesset can dissolve and have new elections at any time, but it can only go a maximum of 4 years between elections. So after a 4-year period of time, that is, by the spring of 2019, new elections would have to be called. And that's what brought us to the first of our 4 elections in 2 years. So before I discuss the results of the first election in 2019, I want to mention that in the coalition built in 2015, a new political party came on the scene that would soon depart the political realm. And I'm going to describe that briefly so that you'll have some background before I dive on into the 2019 election. And that party is Kulanu. Kulanu in Hebrew means all of us. And it was founded by Moshe Kahlon, a politician who was known in the past as a Likudnik, who had, as a communications minister, enacted a number of free market reforms that reduced the cost of cell phones and a number of other reforms that had been beneficial to large segments of the market, but who was seen as a man with a great deal of potential in Israeli politics. Like a lot of people who have potential in Israeli politics, Likud was not the right place for him, because being in Likud means being in the political sphere of Bibi Netanyahu, and anyone who could be a threat to Bibi Netanyahu or does not agree with him ends up leaving Likud and going elsewhere. So it was with Kahlon, who formed a center-right party called Kulanu, focused on more of these technical reforms and much like Yair Lapid, but a little bit farther right, again, reforms to fight corruption and to very much that outsider position, come in from the outside, clean up some of the corruption. This was a man who'd been known to do these kinds of things in the past, so he already had a strong reputation to go with that. Okay, so he was able to join the coalition, and Bibi Netanyahu was able to sit in government for the full 4 years. As we headed into 2019, the other thing that had happened in Israeli politics is that the independent attorney general, who is not someone who works for the prime minister directly, had filed charges against Bibi Netanyahu. There are 4 major cases pending about corruption. These range in allegations, as I've discussed a little bit before, but I'll mention again that Netanyahu was working closely with media personalities, that there were quid pro quos about how certain companies for certain political benefits would offer positive coverage for Netanyahu and so on and so forth. So this is what these cases are about. Now, as I've said before also, a number of witnesses have recanted their testimony. Then there's been some back and forth on that. A large amount of the evidence is circumstantial. However, the state, if you will, believes that they have a case that they can prosecute against the prime minister, for sure. And the prime minister contends that those charges are malicious and politically motivated, that the idea of charging him was to get him out of office. Well, by 2019, he was coming up on 10 years in office consecutively and almost 13 years in office collectively, because he had a stint as prime minister for about 3 years back in the 90s. So this is the situation that was there. In the Israeli political system, the ideal situation when a prime minister is charged with a crime is that the prime minister resigns and faces their charges. That has not happened. And part of the reason is that Bibi Netanyahu is clinging to power. But the other part of the reason is he believes that if he leaves the prime minister's office, he'll be sent to prison, on these charges. So I don't want to give the impression that the charges against him are just circumstantial or that there's no chance he could go to prison. There is a good chance he might beat the charges, but who knows? It's a difficult thing to say. Netanyahu wants a law that minimizes his culpability as prime minister, and for himself and future prime ministers, for some of these things that are being called crimes. They call this the French law. Basically, it exempts certain government officials from certain kinds of laws pertaining to their office. And just stepping back for a second, if the President of the United States could be charged with any crime related to doing his or her job, let's just say, then no president could do anything, right? Because a president could make a decision regarding security or policy decision, right? And then after they leave office, they could be charged and prosecuted for making that decision. And so if that were to be the case, then our presidents would be sitting around all the time twiddling their thumbs and worrying because any decision they make, they could be prosecuted for. So the argument could go both ways on that. In any case, a lot of people see that as Bibi Netanyahu being self-serving, trying to protect himself and trying to keep himself in power. Others might see that he's defending himself. The case could be made that he represents an older generation of elder statesmen, and that in these trying times, his leadership is valuable, his experience, even though there are those who disagree with him here or there. And there's also a feeling out now, at least, that he's handled the virus crisis rather well and has gained some popularity from that. So this is the circumstance that, minus the virus crisis, of course, that prevailed in 2019. Bibi's been in office for a long time. There's a large number of people who want him out. There are charges pending. Bibi's trying to protect himself, and that's the situation that Israeli politics found itself in when the 2019 election was called. Those elections were set for April 9th of 2019. Again, Israel doesn't have fixed terms, so the election could be set for any date, but the Knesset dissolved, and usually that upon dissolution, there's a 90-day process that Parliament goes through. Last point, when Parliament dissolves, it establishes a caretaker government. Usually it's the outgoing Prime Minister and Cabinet who hold office until the next government is formed. You know, this office that they might hold office for another 100, 120 days, let's say, as this caretaker government. The ideal of a caretaker government is that it is technocratic in nature. That's another one of these terms we use in parliamentary systems. But basically, it's a government that babysits. Right? They lead their ministries, they hold down, they manage the crises that might come along, but they don't make big policy decisions, they don't enact major reforms, they just sit as a caretaker government and kind of manage the day-to-day tasks of government without making any big shifts in policy, without doing any shaking or moving. And that's where Israel has been for most of 2 years now with this kind of caretaker government concept. All right, so the election was set for April 9th, 2019, and let's talk about the results. The big change coming into this election was the entrance of General Benny Gantz into Israeli politics. Benny Gantz was known as a general, person with strong national security credentials, who formed the Resilience Party and later called it Blue and White. And again, after the colors of the Israeli flag, kind of like if a party running in the U.S. were to call itself Red, White, and Blue, it's a very patriotic image to use as a party. A number of parties will use these patriotic imagery. When Ariel Sharon formed his own party, for example, he called it Kadima. Kadima means forward in Hebrew, but it's also an important word in one verse of Israel's national anthem, Hatikva, the hope, where it's used there. So it was a very patriotic way of using that kind of imagery. Something like maybe the Star-Spangled Banner Party or the Land of the Free, using a phrase from national security or from the national anthem. In any case, Blue and White, so this Kol-Levan, this draws out that imagery of the Israeli flag, very patriotic, very, that's kind of imagery that Benny Gantz wanted to put forward. And he put out the idea that as a person with valid and strong national security credentials, he could be prime minister and lead a government that did not include Bibi Netanyahu, that he would be a competent center-left replacement for Bibi Netanyahu. And at the time, it was difficult to peg him as even center-left. A lot of the politicians he chose to be in his party were people from the center-right and people from the center-left. And so he looked like he had pretty strong credentials. Basically, he built his political agenda standing on the center of the political spectrum, building this idea that he would simply be a competent alternative to Bibi, and whether the coalition was right or left would more or less depend on which parties joined the coalition. Since obviously the left was the parties that most eagerly wanted to dispatch Netanyahu, he ended up kind of leaning left. It didn't take long for he and Yair Lapid to fall into each other's gravity and into each other's sphere, let's say. The agenda that Benny Gantz put forward, this reform agenda, was, and of course, unseating Bibi Netanyahu, whom now he portrays as being corrupt and criminal and somebody who's dodging responsibility for his acts by clinging to the prime minister's office and so on and so forth. A lot of rhetoric he had to go with there. This fell in very nicely with Yair Lapid's outsider anti-corruption agenda, which had been in opposition for 4 years. Well, here you had what looked like a pretty good pairing. You have a general with great national security credentials and Yair Lapid, a man with great domestic policy credentials, right? So this made a good team. So they decided to run as a single list. So they combined their two parties and ran as blue and white. Blue had also been the color of the Yesh Atid party, the color that they had used a lot in their political marketing. So that worked pretty well from them. Well, that coalition brought together those two parties, that whole agenda, into one party list. And the idea was that party was going to go compete with Bibi Netanyahu. They would bring together a coalition of center-left and center-right parties and oust him from power, oust him from office. And that was basically what the campaign was about. All of these elections over the last 2 years have really been very much a referendum on Bibi Netanyahu. And that's a good and bad thing. So let's go into the results. So on April 9th, 2019, Israeli voters went to the polls, and after the polls had closed and the results had been tabulated, just to take a side note here, when Israelis vote, they vote in person. They have to turn up in person. Mail-in voting is really a rarity. Soldiers generally, if they can be given leave, will go home to vote, or they'll vote at their bases. Israelis overseas don't, unless they go back to Israel, generally don't get to vote. And there's been talk of allowing Israelis overseas to vote. American citizens who live in Israel are often able to vote in our presidential elections at a place of residence in the U.S. So there's some back and forth you could say there. But in any case, Israeli elections are held in person, and you have to be able to show ID. So just a little aside there. In any case, the results are trustworthy. Very rarely do people challenge the validity of the election. And again, this was the second election that was held where a 3.25% threshold was set for parties to earn seats in the Knesset. So any party that failed to earn 3.25% would not have seats in the Knesset, and parties that earn more than that would. So basically, you have to earn 4 seats worth of votes in order to hold seats in the Knesset. All right. So Likud came in first with 35 seats out of 120, their percentage of the vote. And Blue and White also had 35 seats, so they tied in essence. There were slightly more votes for Likud, not a complete percentage point, but a higher, beyond the decimal, right, for Likud. So Likud did just edge out in terms of the popular vote, Blue and White. But again, much like the electoral college system in America, the popular vote is largely irrelevant. In the Israeli system, it really doesn't matter if one party got 10 votes more than the other if they have the same number of seats proportionately in the Knesset, right? So they tied at 35 seats apiece, even though Likud just edged out Blue and White with a handful of other votes. Those two parties together thus had 70 seats out of the Knesset. So the remaining 50 seats were only divided up among the rest of the smaller parties. And those included the Sephardic Orthodox Haredi party Shas with 8 seats, the Ashkenazic Haredi Ultra-Orthodox party United Torah Judaism, or UTJ, with 8 seats, Labor with 6. As I've mentioned before, now that the center-left is in existence, Labor has fallen way down as a political force. It used to be the main second party. They used to be the first party, eventually the second party that would compete with Likud, and now for the last 2 decades, they have very much been third, fourth, and here way down the list. Anyway, beyond Labor, Yisrael Beitenu down at 5, Yisrael Beteinu's leader, Avigdor Lieberman, was among those who left the coalition and attacked Bibi for staying in office. Of course, Lieberman's been involved in Israeli politics for over 3 decades, and he's not going anywhere. He has no plans to retire, but he's attacking Bibi as a criminal and a guy who stayed in office too long and all that sort of rhetoric, too. There was a united right-wing party similar to the National Zionist Party that I talked about in a previous episode. That is a far-right party, a union of very far-right parties. These are kind of the fascist right in Israel. Then there was Meretz, the Vigor Party, the far-left dovish peace protest party, with 4 seats, and Kulanu, Moshe Kahlon's party, fell down to 4 seats from the last Knesset that it had been in. All right, Joint List earned 10 seats. So that's the full 120 seats of the Knesset, right? In that, we saw this situation where Bibi Netanyahu had natural coalition partners that added up to 56 seats, and the Gantz-Lapid coalition to 54, right? Well, that meant that nobody had a majority. Nobody could put together 61 seats, right? Well, the more parties, or parties worth a greater number of seats, had recommended Bibi Netanyahu to be prime minister. So President Reuven Rivlin, whom we call Ruby, gave Bibi Netanyahu the first go at forming a coalition. And Bibi got pretty close. Again, just 5 seats shy of a majority, but could not come up with a majority. So the president went ahead and gave Benny Gantz and Yair Lapid a chance to form a coalition. The plan with Blue and White had been that Benny Gantz would be prime minister for 2 years, and then Yair Lapid would be prime minister for 2 years in rotation, something along those lines. But again, the partnership betwixt the two was mostly about combining their national security and domestic policy agendas and the value of both of those. In any case, they only had about 52 seats, so they couldn't form a coalition either. With no coalition formed, President Rivlin held several meetings with Benny Gantz personally and Bibi Netanyahu personally, where the 3 of them sat in the room trying to form some kind of a deal. Is there a chance that they could form a unity coalition, much like the hung parliament that took place in 1984, where the unlikely partnership of Yitzhak Shamir and Shimon Peres was brought together to form a unity government between Likud and Labor that was able to govern for 4 years in rotation, Shimon Peres for 2 years and then Yitzhak Shamir for 2 more years, right? They were able to reissue the new Israeli shekel and put the economy on a little bit more of a free market footing and head in a new direction economically, right? That was a big step. Well, could that happen again? And after significant negotiation, Benny Gantz just was not going to accept a coalition with Bibi Netanyahu on the terms that Bibi Netanyahu had put forth. Bibi Netanyahu was not willing to accept the coalition with Benny Gantz on the terms that he had put forth. And so, with a completely hung parliament, no way of forming a coalition, it was decided that they would hold a second election. Never happened before. Now, Israel's had elections that came close together. After all, they had an election in 2013 and one in 2015, just 2 years apart. You can just imagine here in the U.S., if we had a presidential election 2 years apart, that'd be kind of weird. Our system isn't even designed for that to happen. But you can just imagine if any time a president resigned or left office or something, there was a special election, or if Congress could call a special election any time, just imagine having a presidential election after 2 years. It's crazy, right? It's too short a time, you might say. But at the same time, in the Israeli political system, if no coalition can be formed and there is a completely hung parliament, then they go to a new election. And so elections were scheduled for September 17th of 2019, and they would decide to go at it again. But this sort of shows what happens when, in a multi-party proportional system, things break down. Usually in these systems, there is some way of working through these kinds of problems. Parties naturally want to be in the coalition, and usually they can find some way to negotiate their way into a coalition and sell it to their constituents somehow. right? In the case of the 1984 hung parliament, both Likud and Labor leaders were able to sell it to the voters that, well, nobody had won, so we worked together and did the best we could with what we had, right? And so, nobody goes home happy because the people on the right don't get anything, don't get a hard right agenda, and the people on the left don't get a hard left agenda. But at least there was a decent government, and it did a lot of important things. That wasn't really possible in this situation for two reasons. One was the group of people who, Benny Gantz, Yair Lapid, Avigdor Lieberman, and a number of others who simply refused to join a coalition led by Bibi Netanyahu for their own reasons. Another reason, Bibi Netanyahu refused to quit. If he'd perhaps left Likud, perhaps they might have formed a unity government. We'll never know. And so that these elections are very much a personal referendum on Bibi is why they keep happening over and over again like this. If you look at the election results, again, this is multi-party proportional democracy, so it's not as simple as Bibi won more seats, therefore he wins, right? You have to get to 61 seats. You have to have a majority. But at the same time, when you look at it, no, Bibi didn't win outright, but he also didn't lose. He did come in ahead. He and his natural coalition partners came in ahead of his political opposition. He had more votes in the Knesset than those who wanted to unseat him, right? So one of those odd political situations where you can say that Bibi didn't win, but he also didn't lose. And that's kind of an odd political situation to be in. Again, in our system here in the U.S., we have an A-B binary, ones and zeros. Either you won the gubernatorial election or you lost. You either won the presidency or you didn't. Once that's decided and a person takes office as president, governor, as a representative or senator or whatever, that's done, right? It's no longer in debate. There's no coalition building process. There's no complicated system where you can win an election and then lose, right? But that's how Israel ended up with its second election in a year. And I'll be back in part 2 to talk about that in the next supplement. As always, I hope you're enjoying Inside Israel News. Visit me at insideisrael.news or find our Facebook page. Would love to see your feedback. And you can also, on the website, look at other podcast episodes and, of course, connect with some of my writings and other topics on the Israeli government and what I've written in the past about Israeli politics. So hope you'll enjoy that. Look forward to the next episode and creating more content. And if you have any suggestions, anything you want to know, any questions, let me know. With that, we'll say להתראות. Goodbye.
אולי נפליגה בספינות מחוף אילת עד חוף שלהם ועל המשחטות הישנות יטעינו תפוחי זהב